Okay, so in today's video, all that we're going to do is take a second and look back at what we've been talking about for the last part of the chapter. So this is kind of going to be like a mini review video for the first part of the chapter. So far in this chapter, we have learned to write the equations of lines in two different ways. The first way was called slope-intercept form. Now for slope-intercept form, we said it's called that because in the equation you can see the slope and the y-intercept. So the equation looks like this: y equals mx plus b. In this equation, the m is the slope and the b is the y-intercept, hence the name, slope-intercept form. The second way that we learned how to write the equation of a line was what was called point-slope form. Again, in point-slope form, it's all in the name. You can tell a point on the graph and the slope straight from the equation. So point-slope form looks like this: y minus y1 equals m parentheses x minus x1. Now when we first learned this, we said this seems really complicated, but it's actually easier than it seems. In this equation, the y1 is the y value from the ordered pair, from the point that we are given. The m is still the slope, because m is always slope. And the x1 is the x value from the point that we are given. So let's practice doing a couple problems. For these first two problems, it says identify the slope and the y-intercept of the following lines. Then write the equations of the lines in slope-intercept form. Now you need to know, for the big summative that's coming up, what slope-intercept form means. I'm not going to tell you that, oh, by the way, is y equals mx plus b. You're going to need to know that because of the name. So first, let's find the slope and the y-intercept. If I look at this graph, the slope would be calculated by looking at rise over run. Now on this picture, I would rise 2, run 1, which means it would reduce to a positive 2. The y-intercept is just where we cross the y-axis, which is at the positive 1. So if I put those things together, I would get y equals 2x plus 1, and I'm done. In problem 2, it flat out tells me this is the slope and this is the y-intercept. I don't even have to find them. So all I would do is put it together and say y equals 3x plus 8. Now for problems 3 and 4, the directions say write the equations of the following lines in point-slope form. Once again, when it comes to the test, I'm not going to tell you what point-slope form is. You are responsible for knowing that. So I know that if I want to use point-slope form, I need a point and I need a slope because it's in the name. I usually write down the coordinates of the point that are farthest to the left because it's kind of like reading a sentence. You start on the left. The coordinates of that point would be 0, 0. The slope here would be, again, rise over run. So rise 3, run 1, which reduces to 3. When I put that together and I make an equation in point-slope form, I would do y minus the y value, which is 0, equals 3 parentheses x minus the x value, which is 0. And I'm done. For problem 4, they flat out tell me this is the point and this is the slope. So if I put that together, I would have y minus the y value, which is 8, equals the slope, which is 3, parentheses x minus the x value, which is 0. And I'm done. We've also learned about special kinds of lines, like vertical and horizontal lines. We said whenever you're dealing with vertical or horizontal lines, the key word here is vuxhoi. The V in the vux part stands for vertical lines. The U stands for they have an undefined slope. And the x stands for they have x equals a number in their equation. Now the h in the hoy part stands for horizontal lines. The O stands for they have a 0, or we think about it as being the number 0, slope. And the Y stands for they have Y equals a number in their equation. So let's try this. In problem number 5, I can see that I'm looking at a vertical line. So I would write down VUX. Now I see because it's a vertical line, I would use the letter x in the equation. So I would write x equals, and then the number that it crosses through is 1. In problem number 6, I can see that I'm looking at a horizontal line. So I would write down the word hoy. I can see that if I have a horizontal line, I should be using the letter y in the equation. And I can see that the y value it crosses through is a -1. So my answer would be y equals -1. The last thing that we've talked about so far in this chapter is graphing equations in point-slope form and parallel and perpendicular lines. So let's talk about graphing. If I want to graph an equation that looks like this, a lot of students would say distribute, get the y by itself, try to graph it that way. But we know from experience that if we rearrange, we get decimals. So don't rearrange this. Instead, to avoid getting decimals and make sure it's easy to graph, let's just see if we can pull out the point and the slope from the equation. Now the point is going to have two pieces, an x and a y. The x is always the number that's by the x, which would be a +4, and the y is the number that's by the y, which would be a +5. Remember, the x and the y values are always the opposite sign of the numbers that you can see in the problem. So if it looks like a -4, it's actually a +4. If it looks like a -5, it's actually a +5. Now the slope would be the number outside of the parentheses, so -1. When I want to graph that, I'm going to start with the point. So I'm going to go right 4 spaces, up 5 spaces, and put a point there. Now my slope is -1. I find that writing -1 divided by 1 gives me a better picture of the rise and the run. From here I would go down 1, right 1, down 1, right 1. I could also go up 1, left 1. That's totally fine. And my last step here would be to draw a line. Finally, we've talked about parallel and perpendicular lines. The only thing we really need to know here is that parallel lines have equal slopes. So an example of two parallel lines would be y equals 3x minus 5 and y minus 2 equals 3 parentheses x plus 1. The reason these would be considered parallel is because of the 3 and the 3 being the same. Now, perpendicular lines have opposite, reciprocal slopes. That means you need to make two changes. You need to take your fraction and flip it over. And you also need to switch the sign to a positive to a negative or a negative to a positive. So we say we switch and flip. Here's an example. Y equals 3x minus 5 and y minus 2 equals -1/3 x plus 1. The reason that these would be perpendicular is because of the 3 and the -1/3. They are opposite reciprocals of each other. That's it. That's what we've learned so far. So I will see you guys tomorrow.